The blood dripped from Owen Turner's arm as he stared down the barrel of his Colt revolver, his eyes never leaving the lifeless body of the outlaw who tried to rob the Mojave stagecoach. He didn't even acknowledge the wound that was soaking his shirt-sleeve crimson, just like he hadn't acknowledged the dozens of other injuries he'd accumulated over his 10 years riding the dusty trails of Arizona Territory. It was 1878, and the West was still wild enough that a man like Owen didn't have time to worry about his own well-being. At 32, his body already told the story of a hard life, a jagged scar across his cheek from a knife fight in Tombstone, a permanently stiffened finger from a break that never healed right, and countless other marks that mapped his journey from Pennsylvania farm boy to feared gunslinger and occasional bounty hunter. "You're bleeding, Turner," Sheriff Miller called out, walking over to examine the scene as townsfolk began to emerge from the buildings lining Mojave's Main Street. Owen holstered his weapon with a practiced motion and glanced down at his arm as if noticing the wound for the first time. "Just a graze," he replied, his voice carrying the gravelly quality of someone who spoke rarely and drank whiskey often. "You ought to get that looked at," the sheriff insisted, but Owen was already turning away. "Waste of time," he muttered, heading toward the saloon. What he needed was a drink, not doctoring. Pain was just another companion on the trail, like hunger and loneliness. You acknowledged it, then pushed it aside to focus on staying alive. The Rusty Spur Saloon welcomed him with familiar sounds, the tinkling of a poorly tuned piano, the clink of glasses, and the low rumble of men's voices sharing tales that grew taller with each telling. Owen took a seat at the bar, ordered whiskey, and poured a splash over his bleeding arm before taking a long swallow. "That don't look good, Owen," the bartender commented, eyeing the wound. Owen shrugged. "Had worse." It was true. He'd been shot twice before, stabbed once, and had fallen from enough horses to know exactly how it felt to have ribs crack against hard ground. Pain was part of living out here, and a man who fretted over every injury wouldn't last long. He was halfway through his second whiskey when the saloon doors swung open and a woman he'd never seen before walked in. The piano player hit a wrong note, then another. As heads turned to watch her approach the bar, she wasn't dressed like a saloon girl. Her dark blue dress was plain but well made, and she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who knew her own worth. Her honey-colored hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her eyes, a striking shade of green, surveyed the room with calm assessment. "I'm looking for Sheriff Miller," she announced to the bartender, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent. "Just missed him, madam," the bartender replied. "He's down at the stage depot dealing with that attempted robbery." Owen watched as she nodded her thanks. When she turned to leave, her gaze swept over him, pausing at the blood-stained sleeve of his shirt. "You're injured," she stated simply. "It's nothing," Owen replied, turning back to his drink. To his surprise, she didn't leave. Instead, she approached him directly. "I'm Bethany Keller," she said. "I'm the new doctor in Mojave." Owen nearly choked on his whiskey. "Doctor?" "Yes," she answered, unfazed by his reaction. "And that wound needs attention before infection sets in." Several of the saloon patrons chuckled. Old man Jenkins called out, "You got yourself a lady doctor, Turner." Owen ignored them all, studying the woman's face. She met his gaze steadily, without the fear or wariness most people showed when facing him. Either she didn't know his reputation, or she didn't care. "I've treated myself plenty of times," he said, with whiskey and hope. Bethany asked, glancing at the bottle. "I have proper medical supplies in my office across the street. It won't take long." Owen wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially by strangers. Most people in Mojave knew to give him a wide berth. He opened his mouth to refuse again when Sheriff Miller entered the saloon. "Dr. Keller," Miller called out, "I see you've met our local troublemaker." "We were just getting acquainted," she replied, not taking her eyes off Owen. Miller approached them, his face serious. "Turner here saved the stage today, shot an outlaw who was trying to rob it. And got himself shot in the process," Bethany observed. "It's just a graze," Owen insisted for what felt like the dozenth time. "Turner doesn't concern himself with injuries," Miller explained to Bethany. Man's got more scars than a battlefield. Well, this particular injury needs proper treatment, Bethany insisted. She turned back to Owen. Mr. Turner, I can treat you here if you're reluctant to visit my office, but that wound needs cleaning and bandaging. Owen downed the rest of his whiskey, feeling cornered. The entire saloon was watching now, and he realized the only way to end this spectacle was to acquiesce. Fine, he muttered. Do what you need to do, doctor. Bethany nodded and turned to the bartender. I need clean water, towels, and as much light as you can provide. The bartender hurried to comply while Bethany removed a small bag from her shoulder that Owen hadn't noticed before. From it, she produced several items: bandages, a bottle of clear liquid, scissors, and thread. I need to cut away your sleeve, she said, approaching Owen with the scissors. He nodded grimly and extended his arm. The wound was still seeping blood, though slower now. As she carefully cut the fabric away from his skin, Owen became uncomfortably aware of how close she was standing. He caught the faint scent of lavender, so out of place in the whiskey and tobacco atmosphere of the saloon. This will sting, she warned as she uncorked the bottle of clear liquid. Owen didn't flinch when she poured it over the wound, though the burning sensation was intense. He'd expected her to work quickly, clinically, but instead she treated him with surprising gentleness, cleaning away the blood with careful dabs of a wet cloth. What struck him most, however, was her silence. Unlike most people in his experience who felt compelled to fill quiet moments with needless chatter, Dr. Bethany Keller worked in complete concentration, her focus entirely on his wound. There was something strangely intimate about it, this shared silence as she tended to him. The bullet grazed you deeply, she finally said, examining the clean wound. You'll need stitches. Owen nodded, watching her thread a needle. Her hands were steady, sure, not what he would have expected from a woman doctor fresh from the East. How long have you been in Mojave? He asked, surprising himself with the question. 3 days, she answered, positioning the needle. This is going to hurt. I'm familiar with pain, doctor. She glanced up at him briefly before pushing the needle through his skin. I don't doubt that, Mr. Turner. As she worked, Owen found himself studying her face. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 27 or 28, but there was a seriousness about her that made her seem older. Her forehead creased slightly in concentration as she placed each stitch with precision. What brings a female doctor all the way to Mojave? He asked as she tied off the 4th stitch. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, without looking up from her work, she said, opportunity. The town advertised for a doctor. I applied. And they hired you, knowing you were a woman. A slight smile curved her lips. I may have neglected to mention that detail in my correspondence. Despite himself, Owen felt a reluctant admiration. It took courage to travel alone to a frontier town, especially for a woman in her profession. Sheriff Miller didn't seem surprised, he observed. No, she agreed, starting another stitch. He's been quite supportive, actually, said Mojave needed a doctor badly enough that my gender was irrelevant. The saloon had returned to its normal activities, the novelty of watching Owen get stitched up having worn off. Only a few curious onlookers still glanced their way occasionally. When Bethany finished the last stitch, she reached for a clean bandage. I need to wrap this to keep it clean, she explained. Would you mind removing your shirt entirely? It would be easier. Owen hesitated only briefly before unbuttoning his shirt one-handed and slipping it off. He was aware of the way her eyes flickered over his torso, noting the web of old scars that marked his skin. You've lived a dangerous life, Mr. Turner, she commented as she began wrapping the bandage around his arm. Just life out here, he replied. Her fingers were cool against his skin as she secured the bandage. When she was done, she stepped back to examine her work, then began packing her supplies. Keep it clean, she instructed. Change the bandage daily. Come see me in 3 days so I can check on the stitches. Owen pulled his ruined shirt back on. What do I owe you? Nothing, she said, closing her bag. Sheriff Miller mentioned you saved the stage. Consider it payment for a service to the town. He frowned. I don't take charity, doctor. It's not charity, Mr. Turner. It's an exchange. She met his eyes directly. However, if you insist on payment, you could escort me to the sheriff's office. I still need to speak with him, and I'm not yet familiar with all of Mojave's residents." Owen understood her meaning. A woman walking alone, even a doctor, was vulnerable in a town like this. He nodded, standing up. "I can do that." Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows down Mojave's dusty main street. Owen walked beside Bethany in silence, conscious of the eyes watching them from storefronts and saloon windows. "People are staring," Bethany observed quietly. "Not at you," Owen replied. "At me, walking with the new doctor instead of shooting at something." "Is that your usual pastime?" she asked, and he detected a hint of humor in her voice, according to town gossip. They reached the sheriff's office, and Owen paused at the door. "Sheriff's inside." "You'll be safe from here." Bethany turned to face him. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. Remember, clean bandages and see me in 3 days." Owen nodded, suddenly awkward under her direct gaze. "I'll remember." As she turned to enter the sheriff's office, Owen found himself speaking again. "Dr. Keller." She looked back at him. "Welcome to Mojave." A small smile touched her lips. "Thank you, Mr. Turner." As Owen walked away, he was aware of an unfamiliar sensation. His arm throbbed dully beneath the bandage, but for the first time in years, he actually cared about a wound healing properly. He told himself it was just because he needed his shooting arm in working order. It had nothing to do with the prospect of seeing Dr. Bethany Keller again in 3 days. Nothing at all. The next morning dawned hot and clear, the Arizona sun already fierce by the time Owen left his small cabin on the outskirts of town. His arm ached, the pain sharper than he'd expected, but he ignored it as he saddled his horse. He had business in a nearby settlement, tracking down information about a gang that had been robbing stages along the Mojave route. By midday, the pain had intensified, and he noticed a warmth radiating from the bandage that couldn't be explained by the desert heat alone. When he stopped at a creek to water his horse, he unwrapped the bandage to examine the wound. The skin around the stitches was red and puffy. Owen cursed under his breath. Infection was setting in, despite the doctor's careful work. He should turn back to Mojave, but his contact was expecting him, and information about the gang couldn't wait. He rebandaged the wound and continued riding, pushing through the discomfort. By the time he reached the settlement of Copper Springs, sweat beaded his forehead that had nothing to do with the afternoon heat. His meeting with a former outlaw named Reyes yielded valuable information. The gang was planning another robbery, this time targeting a shipment of bank money coming through on Friday's stage. Owen paid Reyes for the information and headed back toward Mojave, eager to inform Sheriff Miller. The return journey was significantly more difficult. His entire arm burned now, and occasional chills ran through his body despite the desert heat. When he finally spotted the lights of Mojave in the distance, darkness had fallen, and Owen was fighting to stay in the saddle. He made it as far as the livery stable before nearly falling from his horse. The stable hand, a teenager named Jimmy, rushed to help him. "Mr. Turner, you don't look so good," the boy said, steadying him. "I'm fine," Owen insisted, though he knew it was a lie. "Just need rest." "That arm's looking bad," Jimmy observed, eyeing the blood-stained bandage. "Should I fetch Dr. Keller?" "No," Owen said firmly. "Just help me get my horse settled." Once his mount was taken care of, Owen managed to walk toward his cabin, but his vision was beginning to blur. The infection was taking hold faster than he'd anticipated. Reluctantly, he changed direction, heading toward the small building with "Doctor" painted on the front window. A lamp still burned inside despite the late hour. Owen hesitated at the door, his pride warring with practicality. Finally, pain won out over stubbornness, and he knocked. Bethany opened the door a moment later, dressed in a simple house dress rather than the more formal attire she'd worn the day before. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and for a moment, Owen forgot why he'd come. "Mr. Turner," she said, her professional demeanor returning instantly when she saw him swaying on her doorstep. "Come in." "The wound," he managed to say as she guided him inside. "Think it's infected?" "Sit," she ordered, pointing to an examination table in the center of the room. Owen complied, suddenly too weary to stand anyway. The doctor's office was neat and well organized, medical texts lining bookshelves along one wall and a curtain at the back presumably leading to her living quarters. Bethany unwrapped his bandage with quick, efficient movements. Her expression darkened when she saw the angry red flesh beneath. "This is significantly infected," she said. "Did you change the bandage as I instructed?" Owen looked away. "Been riding, tracking outlaws." She made a sound of exasperation. "You've been riding in dusty conditions with an open wound. Did you even listen to anything I told you yesterday?" "Had important business," he muttered. "More important than your arm, than your life." She shook her head in disbelief. "You have a fever, the infection is spreading." "Can you fix it?" he asked. "I can try," she replied, moving to a cabinet and removing several bottles. "But it won't be pleasant." Over the next hour, Bethany cleaned the wound thoroughly, removed the infected stitches, drained the buildup of pus, and restitched the wound. Throughout the procedure, Owen gritted his teeth against the pain, refusing any offered laudanum. "You're stubborn," Bethany observed as she wrapped a fresh bandage around his arm. "Been called worse," he replied, his voice strained. "You'll need to stay here tonight," she said. "I need to monitor the fever and make sure the infection doesn't worsen." Owen started to protest, but the room chose that moment to spin alarmingly. He gripped the edge of the table with his good hand. "That wasn't a suggestion, Mr. Turner," Bethany said firmly. "I have a cot in the back room for patients who need observation." Too weak to argue, Owen allowed himself to be led to a small room behind the examination area. A narrow cot stood against one wall, a small table beside it. Bethany helped him lie down, then brought a basin of cool water and a cloth. "I'll need to keep your fever down," she explained, placing the wet cloth on his forehead. The coolness was blessed relief against his burning skin. Owen closed his eyes, suddenly exhausted. "Why do you do it?" Bethany asked softly. He opened his eyes to find her watching him with a puzzled expression. "Do what?" "Disregard your own well-being," she clarified. "Sheriff Miller says you've been shot before, stabbed, beaten, yet you never seek proper medical care. You act as if your body is just a tool, not something worth preserving." Owen was silent for a long moment. No one had ever asked him that before. "Out here," he finally said. "A man who worries too much about getting hurt usually ends up dead. Better to focus on the job." "There's a difference between caution and neglect," she countered, refreshing the cloth on his forehead. "You neglect yourself, Mr. Turner. I wonder why." Owen didn't have an answer for her, or at least, not one he was willing to share. How could he explain that for the past decade, since losing his family to a senseless act of violence, he hadn't much cared whether he lived or died? That each dangerous job he took on was partly a hope that this might be the one that finally ended his solitary existence. Instead, he closed his eyes again. "Just Owen," he murmured. "If you're going to keep saving my life, might as well use my given name." "Owen, then," she said, and something in the way she spoke his name made him want to open his eyes again to see her expression. But exhaustion was pulling him under, and before he could look, sleep claimed him. Throughout the night, Owen drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he woke, Bethany was there, replacing the cool cloth on his forehead, checking his pulse, or sometimes just sitting nearby, reading a medical text by lamplight. She never spoke during these moments, just worked in that focused silence he was coming to associate with her. By morning, his fever had broken. Owen woke to sunlight streaming through a small window and the realization that he felt significantly better. The pain in his arm had reduced to a dull throb, and his mind was clear again. He sat up slowly, noticing that someone had removed his boots and covered him with a light blanket. Bethany was nowhere to be seen, but he could hear movement in the front office. Standing carefully, Owen made his way to the door and found Bethany arranging instruments on a tray. She looked up when he appeared. "You should be resting," she said, but her tone was less severe than the night before. "Feeling better," he replied. "Thanks to your care." She approached him and placed a cool hand on his forehead. "Fever's gone, that's good, let me check the wound." Once again, Owen found himself subject to her silent, focused attention as she unwrapped the bandage and examined the stitches. Her proximity was even more distracting in the clear light of morning. and he found himself noticing details he'd missed before: a small scar near her hairline, the faint freckles across her nose, the way her eyelashes cast tiny shadows on her cheeks as she looked down. "The infection is responding to treatment," she announced, reapplying a clean bandage. "But you're not out of danger yet. You'll need to rest today, preferably here where I can monitor you." "I need to see the sheriff," Owen said. "Got information about the gang planning to rob Friday's stage." Bethany's eyes widened slightly. "Is that what you were doing yesterday, gathering intelligence about the robbery?" Owen nodded. "I'll fetch the sheriff," she offered. "You can tell him what you know without leaving here." Before Owen could argue, she was already putting on a light shawl. "Don't move from that cot," she instructed firmly. "I'll return shortly." Left alone in the office, Owen took the opportunity to look around more carefully. The room reflected Bethany's organized nature, everything in its place, clean and orderly. On her desk sat a framed photograph of an older couple, presumably her parents, and beside it, a medical diploma from a women's college in Philadelphia. He was studying the diploma when the door opened and Bethany returned with Sheriff Miller. "Turner," Miller exclaimed. "Doc says you nearly killed yourself chasing down information." "Worth it," Owen replied, explaining what he'd learned from Ray's about Friday's planned robbery. The sheriff nodded grimly. "I'll wire the marshal in Tucson, see if we can get some deputies up here before Friday. In the meantime, you focus on getting that arm healed." After the sheriff left, Bethany gave Owen a stern look. "Back to bed." "I should return to my cabin," he protested. "So you can ignore my medical advice again?" "I think not." Her tone was professional but firm. "One more day of observation, then you can return home tomorrow if the infection continues to improve." Owen knew that argument would be futile. Besides, a part he wasn't ready to examine too closely didn't mind the idea of spending another day under Bethany's care. "Fine," he conceded. "One more day." Bethany looked surprised at his easy capitulation but quickly recovered. "Good. I have patients to see this morning, but I'll check on you regularly. There's water and some bread on the table if you're hungry." Throughout the morning, Owen drifted in and out of sleep, occasionally overhearing Bethany's voice as she treated patients in the front office. Unlike many doctors he'd encountered who spoke to patients with condescension or impatience, her tone was always respectful and kind, whether she was treating the banker's wife or the stable boy who came in with a splinter. Around midday, the office grew quiet, and Bethany appeared with a tray bearing 2 bowls of stew. "You should eat," she said, setting the tray on the small table, "to regain your strength." Owen sat up, realizing he was indeed hungry. As they ate in companionable silence, he found himself wanting to know more about the woman who had twice now saved him from his own stubborn neglect. "Why medicine?" he asked abruptly. Bethany looked up from her bowl, seemingly unsurprised by the question. "My father was a doctor in Philadelphia. I grew up watching him heal people, easing their suffering. I wanted to do the same. Can't have been an easy path for a woman." "No," she agreed. "Many doors were closed to me, but I found a women's medical college that provided excellent training." "And then you came west," Owen prompted. A shadow crossed her face. "Philadelphia held painful memories. When I saw the advertisement for a doctor in Mojave, it seemed like Providence." Owen sensed there was more to the story but didn't press. Everyone in the West had things they'd left behind, reasons they'd come to this harsh, unforgiving land. Some, like himself, were running from grief. Others from the law or from scandal or simply from the confines of Eastern society. "Your parents must be proud," he said instead, nodding toward the photograph he'd noticed earlier. "They died 3 years ago," Bethany replied quietly. "Influenza epidemic." "I'm sorry," Owen said, recognizing the familiar pain of loss in her eyes. She met his gaze. "And your family?" It was a question he rarely answered truthfully, usually deflecting with vague comments about being a loner by nature. But something about Bethany's direct honesty made him respond in kind. "Dead. 9 years ago, my wife Sarah and our son William died when outlaws raided our farm in Colorado." Bethany's eyes softened with understanding. "Is that why you hunt outlaws now?" "Partly," he acknowledged. Started as revenge, now it's just what I do. And why you don't care if you get hurt, she concluded, the pieces falling into place. Owen didn't confirm or deny this, but he didn't need to. The truth of it hung in the air between them. After a moment, Bethany stood and collected their empty bowls. You should rest more, she said. I'll be seeing patients again this afternoon. As she turned to leave, Owen found himself speaking. Doc Bethany, she paused, looking back at him. Thank you, not just for, he gestured at his bandaged arm, but for not asking more questions. A small smile touched her lips. Rest, Owen, we all have ghosts we'd rather not discuss. The afternoon passed slowly. Owen dozed, listened to the murmur of voices from the front office, and contemplated the strange twist of fate that had brought him to this doctor's back room. By evening, his restlessness had grown, and when Bethany came to check on him, she found him standing by the small window. You should be resting, she chided, though without much conviction. Been resting all day, he replied. Getting stiff. She approached to examine his bandage. The infection is definitely improving. I think you can return to your cabin tomorrow, provided you promise to keep the wound clean and change the bandages daily. I promise, Owen said, and meant it. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. Owen became acutely aware of how close she was standing, of the faint lavender scent that seemed to cling to her skin. Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition, perhaps, of the unusual bond they'd formed in such a short time. Bethany stepped back first, professional demeanor returning. I'll change your bandage once more before you sleep. After she'd rewrapped his arm, Owen expected her to leave, but instead she settled into the chair beside his cot. Tell me about your son, she said softly. The request startled him. No one had asked about William in years. Most people in Mojave didn't even know he'd had a family. Why? He asked. Because sometimes speaking of those we've lost helps keep their memory alive, she replied simply. Owen was silent for so long that Bethany began to rise, clearly thinking she'd overstepped. I apologize, it was too personal. He was 5, Owen said suddenly, the words coming from some long buried place within him. Smart as a whip. Had his mother's eyes, blue as the summer sky, loved horses. Used to beg me to take him riding every day. Once he started speaking, the memories flowed more easily than he would have imagined. He told her about William's laugh, about Sarah's talent for growing flowers in their harsh Colorado soil, about the small life they'd built together before it was shattered. Bethany listened without interruption, her face compassionate but not pitying. When he finally fell silent, she reached out and briefly touched his hand. They sound wonderful, she said. Thank you for telling me about them. The simple acknowledgement of his loss, not dismissing it, not offering empty platitudes about time healing all wounds, touched something in Owen that had been frozen for years. Your turn, he said. Tell me what brought you to Mojave, the real reason. Bethany's eyes widened slightly, but then she nodded, as if accepting that their exchange of confidences should be mutual. I was engaged, she said. To another doctor. He supported my medical studies, or claimed to. But when I finished my training and joined his practice, he expected me to take a secondary role, to treat the women and children while he handled the important cases. Her voice held a trace of bitterness that Owen hadn't heard before. When I insisted on equal standing, he ended our engagement. Then he spread rumors that questioned my competence, my morality. Soon I could barely walk down the street without whispers following me. So you came west, Owen concluded. Yes, where people care more about whether you can stop bleeding than about your gender. She smiled faintly. Though I admit I'm still proving myself here. Not to me, Owen said quietly. You saved my arm, maybe my life. Their eyes met again, and this time the connection between them was unmistakable. Owen was suddenly very aware of how many years it had been since he'd allowed himself to feel anything beyond the necessary emotions for survival. The realization that this woman was awakening something long dormant within him was both exhilarating and terrifying. The moment was broken by the sound of the front door opening, followed by a frantic voice calling for the doctor. Bethany was on her feet instantly, hurrying toward the commotion. Owen followed, his curiosity overcoming his weakness. In the front office stood a miner Owen recognized vaguely from town, his clothes covered in blood. "It's Jenkins," the man was saying. "Cave in at the Copper Creek mine. He's trapped, leg crushed bad." "Where is he?" Bethany asked, already gathering supplies, brought him to the assay office. "Closest building with a table." "I'll need help," Bethany said, looking around and spotting Owen. "You should be resting, but I'm coming," Owen said firmly. She hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Bring that bag," she instructed, pointing to a large medical bag by the door. The assay office was chaotic. When they arrived, miners crowded around a makeshift examination table where old Jenkins lay, his leg a mangled mess below the knee. The man was pale but conscious, his face contorted in agony. "Everyone out," Bethany ordered as she entered, her voice carrying such authority that even the burliest miners obeyed without question. "Except you," she added to Owen. "I need an assistant." Over the next 2 hours, Owen witnessed a side of Bethany he hadn't seen before. Gone was the gentle healer who had tended his wound in silence. In her place was a surgeon of remarkable skill and unwavering focus, working methodically to save as much of Jenkins' leg as possible. She spoke only to issue instructions: "Hold this, hand me that, more light here," and Owen complied without question. When it became clear that part of the leg couldn't be saved, she performed the amputation with swift precision, her hands never trembling despite the gravity of the task. When it was finally done, Jenkins stabilized and sleeping under laudanum, Bethany stepped outside for air. Owen followed, concerned by the pallor of her face. "Are you all right?" he asked. She took a deep breath, staring up at the night sky. "I hate amputations," she said quietly. "Necessary evils. You saved his life," Owen pointed out, "but changed it forever." She looked at him. "This is why I became a doctor, to help people, but sometimes helping means causing pain, taking away part of someone." Without thinking, Owen reached out and touched her shoulder. "You gave him a future. That's more than most people do for others in a lifetime." Bethany's expression softened, and for a moment she leaned slightly into his touch. Then, straightening her shoulders, she became the professional doctor again. "We should get you back to rest," she said. "You've overexerted yourself." Owen didn't argue, suddenly aware of how drained he felt. The walk back to her office was silent, both of them processing the intensity of what they'd just experienced together. At the door to the back room, Bethany paused. "Thank you for your help tonight. You were exactly what I needed." The words hung in the air between them, carrying more meaning than either was ready to acknowledge. Owen merely nodded, unable to find words for the conflicting emotions surging through him. "Good night, Owen," she said softly. "Good night, Bethany." The next morning, Owen returned to his cabin on the outskirts of town. True to his word, he followed Bethany's instructions meticulously, changing his bandage daily and keeping the wound clean. For the first time in years, he found himself caring about his own recovery, not just so he could return to work, but because each improvement was another reason to visit the doctor's office. These visits were brief, professional on the surface. Bethany would check his wound, change the bandage, and send him on his way. But each time they would share a few minutes of conversation about the town, about her other patients, without breaking confidences, about books they had read or places they had seen. Owen found himself looking forward to these moments with an eagerness that both confused and alarmed him. He told himself it was natural to enjoy the company of an intelligent, compassionate woman, especially one who had seen him at his most vulnerable and hadn't judged him for it. But deep down, he recognized that what he was feeling went beyond simple friendship or gratitude. 4 days after Jenkins' accident, Owen was at the livery stable, preparing his horse for a short ride to check on outlying ranches, when Sheriff Miller found him. "Got word from Tucson," Miller said without preamble. "Marshall can't spare any deputies for Friday. We're on our own against this gang." Owen nodded, unsurprised. "How many men can you deputize?" 3, maybe 4. Problem is, most of the able-bodied men in town work the mines or the ranches. "Can't pull them all away." "We'll make do," Owen said. "I've faced worse odds." Miller gave him a searching look. "Your arm healing up?" "Well enough to shoot," Owen assured him. "Good, we'll meet tomorrow to plan." The sheriff turned to go, then paused. That new doctor's something else, isn't she? Half the town's talking about how she saved Jenkins, performed surgery right there in the assay office like she was in some fancy hospital. She's skilled, Owen agreed, keeping his tone neutral. Miller wasn't fooled. Seen you coming and going from her office regular, he observed with a knowing look. Town's starting to talk about that too. Owen stiffened. Just getting my wound treated. Sure, Miller said, not bothering to hide his skepticism. Just remember, Turner, a woman like that deserves better than a man with one foot already in the grave. The sheriff's words hit their mark with uncomfortable accuracy. As Owen finished saddling his horse, he couldn't shake the truth of them. What did he have to offer someone like Bethany? A life of violence and uncertainty. The broken pieces of a man who'd spent nearly a decade not caring whether he lived or died. These thoughts preoccupied him as he rode the perimeter of Mojave's outlying ranches. By the time he returned to town, he'd convinced himself that whatever attraction he felt toward Bethany was best left unexplored. She deserved a whole man, not the shadow he'd become. With this resolution firm in his mind, Owen headed to the saloon rather than the doctor's office, though it was time for his bandage to be changed. One drink turned into several as the evening progressed, and he found himself seated at a corner table with two other regulars, half listening to their conversation about the latest silver strike. He didn't notice Bethany enter the saloon until she was standing at his table, medical bag in hand, her expression a mixture of concern and irritation. "You missed your appointment," she said without preamble. The other men at the table exchanged glances and made hasty excuses to leave, sensing the tension. "Didn't think it was necessary," Owen replied, not meeting her eyes, arms healing fine. "I'll be the judge of that," Bethany countered. "Either you come to my office now, or I examine you right here in the saloon." Several nearby patrons looked up with interest at this exchange. Owen, knowing Bethany well enough by now to realize she meant exactly what she said, grudgingly stood. "Lead the way, doctor," he said, his tone more curt than he'd intended. The walk to her office was silent, the earlier ease between them replaced by a palpable tension. Once inside, Bethany motioned for him to sit on the examination table while she prepared fresh bandages. "Any particular reason you decided to neglect your care today?" she asked as she unwrapped his old bandage. "Been busy," he said shortly. "Planning for Friday?" "Ah, the stage robbery." Her fingers moved efficiently over his wound, which was healing well. "Sheriff Miller mentioned you'd be involved in stopping it. It's my job." "Is it?" She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "I wasn't aware nearly getting killed on a regular basis was an official occupation." Despite his determination to maintain emotional distance, Owen found himself responding to her challenge. "Someone has to stop men like the ones who killed my family, might as well be me. And if you die in the process, what then?" "Then I die," he said flatly. "Makes little difference in the grand scheme." Bethany's hands stilled on his arm. "It would make a difference to some people." The quiet certainty in her voice caught him off guard. Before he could formulate a response, she continued, "You've been given a second chance at life, Owen. Not everyone gets that. The question is whether you're brave enough to take it." "Brave," he repeated, an edge creeping into his voice. "I've faced down outlaws, survived gunfights that should have killed me. Don't talk to me about bravery." "That's not courage," she said, securing his fresh bandage with practiced movements. "That's recklessness born of indifference. Real courage would be allowing yourself to care again, to risk the pain of loss for the possibility of joy." Her words struck too close to the truth, and Owen stood abruptly. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Bethany's voice remained calm, but her eyes held a challenge. "I left everything I knew to come here. I face ridicule and doubt every day because of my gender. But I still choose to care, to heal, to connect with others. That's bravery, Owen." For a moment he said nothing, caught between the desire to flee this uncomfortable confrontation and the growing realization that she understood him better than anyone had in years. "I can't be what you want me to be," he finally said, his voice low. "I haven't asked you to be anything. she replied simply. "Except perhaps a man who values his own life as much as I've come to value it." The admission hung in the air between them, neither willing to acknowledge its full implications. After a long moment, Owen turned toward the door. "I'll be careful on Friday," he said, the closest he could come to a promise. "See that you are," Bethany replied softly. "I'd rather not have to stitch you up again." But they both knew, if it came to that, she would be waiting, ready to heal whatever wounds he brought to her door. Friday dawned clear and hot, the kind of day where heat shimmers rose from the dirt streets of Mojave by mid-morning. Owen met Sheriff Miller and 3 deputized townsfolk at the office to finalize their plan. The stage carrying the bank money was due to pass through Devil's Canyon, a narrow passage about 5 miles outside of town, around noon. According to Owen's information, that's where the gang planned to ambush it. "We'll position ourselves on the ridges above the canyon," Owen explained, pointing to locations on a crude map. "2 men on each side. When they make their move, we'll have the high ground." The deputies, a store clerk named Peterson, a retired soldier called Watts, and the blacksmith Johnson listened attentively, though Owen could see the nervousness in their eyes. These weren't gunmen, they were ordinary townsfolk stepping up to protect their community. "Remember," Sheriff Miller added, "we want to take them alive if possible. Justice should happen in a courtroom, not a canyon." Owen didn't contradict him, but privately he knew that outlaws rarely surrendered peacefully. Someone was likely to die today. As they prepared to ride out, Owen caught sight of Bethany standing outside her office across the street. Their eyes met briefly, and she raised a hand in a small gesture that might have been a wave or a blessing. Either way, it stayed with Owen as they rode out of town, a reminder of someone waiting for his return. The ride to Devil's Canyon was uneventful, giving Owen time to assess the deputies. Watts, with his military background, seemed the most prepared for potential violence. Johnson was physically strong but untested in combat. Peterson looked the most frightened, but there was a determination in his eyes that suggested he'd stand his ground when needed. They arrived with time to spare and took up their positions, Owen and Peterson on one ridge, Sheriff Miller, Watts, and Johnson on the opposite side. From their vantage point, they could see the winding trail through the canyon below, though the heat haze made distances difficult to judge. "What if they don't come?" Peterson whispered as they settled behind an outcropping of rock. "They'll come," Owen replied confidently. "Men like these are predictable, greedy." An hour passed in tense silence. Then, just as the distant sound of the stage could be heard approaching, Owen spotted movement at the far end of the canyon. "There," he murmured, pointing to where 5 riders had appeared, taking positions behind boulders along the canyon floor. 5 of them, just like Ray's said. Peterson swallowed hard but nodded, raising his rifle to a ready position. Across the canyon, Owen could see Sheriff Miller and the others tensing for action. The stage appeared at the mouth of the canyon, the driver pushing the team at a good clip, clearly hoping to get through the dangerous passage quickly. When the stage reached the midpoint of the canyon, the outlaws made their move. "Hands up." One shouted, stepping into the road with a rifle aimed at the driver. "Stop the stage," the driver complied, pulling the team to a halt as the other outlaws emerged from their hiding places. Weapons drawn, Owen waited, watching as 2 of the gang approached the stage. The moment they were fully exposed, he gave the signal a sharp, piercing whistle. "This is Sheriff Miller," the sheriff called out from across the canyon. "Drop your weapons, you're surrounded." The outlaws reacted with practiced speed, diving for cover and firing upward toward the sound of Miller's voice. The air filled with the crack of gunfire as both sides exchanged shots. Owen took careful aim at the leader, who had taken cover behind the stage's wheel. When the man leaned out to fire, Owen squeezed the trigger. The outlaw jerked backward, clutching his shoulder, but didn't go down. Beside Owen, Peterson was firing with more enthusiasm than accuracy, his shots sending up sprays of dirt near the outlaws but not finding their marks. Across the canyon, the sheriff and his men were having better success, pinning down 2 of the gang members behind boulders. The firefight intensified, bullets whining off rocks around Owen's position. He kept his focus, methodically taking shots when targets presented themselves. One outlaw fell, then another was wounded. Then Owen heard a cry of pain from across the canyon. Looking over, he saw Johnson clutching his leg, blood seeping between his fingers. The blacksmith had been hit. The distraction cost him. One of the outlaws had spotted their position and was now firing directly at them. A bullet struck the rock inches from Owen's head, sending stone fragments flying. One caught him across the cheek, opening a shallow cut that immediately began bleeding. "Stay down." Owen ordered Peterson, who looked ready to bolt. Then, calculating the risk, Owen made a decision. "I'm going to circle around behind them, keep firing to hold their attention." Before Peterson could protest, Owen was moving, staying low and using the rocky terrain for cover as he worked his way along the ridge and down a steep path that would bring him behind the outlaw's position. The gunfire continued as he made his stealthy approach. By the time he reached the canyon floor, the situation had shifted. 2 outlaws were down, either dead or seriously wounded. The other 3 had taken the stage driver hostage and were using him as a shield while trying to retreat toward their horses. Owen moved silently through the rocks, getting into position behind the retreating outlaws. When he was within 30 yards, he called out, "Drop your guns or die where you stand," the outlaws whirled, the leader still holding the driver as a shield. "You drop yours," he snarled. "Or the driver gets it." Time seemed to slow as Owen assessed the situation. The leader's gun was pressed to the driver's head. The other 2 outlaws were flanking him, weapons trained on Owen. From the ridges above, the sheriff and the deputies had clear shots at the outlaws but couldn't risk hitting the driver. Owen made his decision in an instant. He appeared to lower his weapon slightly, as if considering surrender. The slight relaxation in the leader's posture was all he needed. In one fluid motion, Owen raised his gun and fired. The bullet struck the leader in the head just above his right eye. He crumpled instantly, his grip on the driver releasing. Before the other outlaws could react, Owen had shifted his aim and fired twice more. One shot found its mark, dropping a second outlaw. The third man managed to get off a return shot before Owen's next bullet struck him in the chest. The outlaw's bullet caught Owen in the side, the impact spinning him halfway around. He maintained his footing, though, his gun still trained on the fallen outlaws to ensure the threat was neutralized. Only when he was certain all 3 were down did Owen allow himself to acknowledge the burning pain in his side. Looking down, he saw blood spreading across his shirt. Sheriff Miller and Watts were making their way down to the canyon floor, while Peterson remained on the ridge, covering them. The stage driver, shaken but unharmed, was checking on the passengers inside the coach. "Turner," Miller called out as he approached. "You hit." "It's nothing," Owen replied automatically, though he could feel blood running down his side beneath his shirt. Miller's eyes narrowed as he took in Owen's appearance, the bleeding cut on his cheek and the growing bloodstain on his shirt. "Like hell it is. Let me see." Reluctantly, Owen allowed the sheriff to examine the wound. The bullet had torn through his side, leaving a deep furrow along his ribs. "You need the doctor," Miller declared. "Johnson too. Watts, help Peterson get Johnson down here. We'll load the wounded on the stage and head back to town." "The outlaws," Owen began, "are either dead or not going anywhere," Miller finished. "We'll send a wagon for them later." Owen wanted to argue but found his strength suddenly waning as the adrenaline of the firefight began to fade. He allowed Miller to help him toward the stage, where the grateful driver was already making room for the wounded. The journey back to Mojave passed in a blur of pain and jostling movement. Owen focused on staying conscious, pressing his bandana against the wound in his side to slow the bleeding. Beside him, Johnson was pale but alert, his leg wound painful but not life-threatening. When they finally reached town, a crowd had gathered, alerted by a rider Miller had sent ahead. Owen saw Bethany pushing through the throng, her medical bag in hand, her face set in professional concentration. As they helped him down from the stage, their eyes met, and he saw the flash of fear quickly masked by Doctor's detachment. She assessed both him and Johnson with a quick glance, then began issuing instructions. "Bring Mr. Johnson to my office. Mr. Turner, can you walk?" Owen nodded, determined not to be carried through town. With Miller supporting one side, he made it to the doctor's office under his own power, though by the time they arrived, his vision was beginning to darken around the edges. Inside, Bethany directed Johnson to a chair while pointing Owen toward the examination table. "Sheriff, I'll need hot water and clean towels," she instructed as she quickly washed her hands. Once Miller had gone to fetch the requested items, Bethany turned to Owen, her professional mask slipping just enough for him to see her concern. "Let me see," she said, helping him remove his bloodied shirt. Her fingers were gentle as she examined both the bullet furrow in his side and the cut on his cheek. "The facial wound is superficial," she concluded, "but this," she indicated his side. "The bullet carved a deep path. You've lost a lot of blood." "Had worse," Owen said, trying for levity. Bethany's eyes flashed. "That doesn't make it acceptable." When Miller returned with the water and towels, Bethany set to work, first checking on Johnson's leg wound and determining it could wait while she addressed Owen's more serious injury. "This will hurt," she warned as she prepared to clean the wound. Owen nodded, bracing himself. As she began working, he focused on her face, the slight furrow between her brows as she concentrated. The way she occasionally caught her lower lip between her teeth when performing a particularly delicate procedure. Unlike their previous encounters, this time she didn't work in complete silence. "The bullet scraped along your rib," she explained as she cleaned the wound. "That actually saved you from more serious damage. Another inch to the left and it would have entered your abdominal cavity." Owen understood what she wasn't saying. He could have died today. Again. And this time, he found he minded that possibility in a way he hadn't for years. The cleaning and stitching process was painful but bearable. Bethany worked with her usual efficiency, her movements precise and confident. When she was finished, she applied a thick bandage and helped him sit up. "You'll need to rest," she told him, her tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. "No riding, no fighting outlaws, no exertion of any kind for at least a week." "Doc," Owen began to protest. "No." The firmness in her voice surprised even Miller, who was helping Johnson to the examination table now that Owen's treatment was complete. "You've torn open your previous wound twice now. I won't have you risking a third time. If I have to, I'll have the sheriff lock you up to keep you still." Miller chuckled. "She means it, Turner. I've seen that look before." Too exhausted to argue, Owen nodded. "A week," he agreed reluctantly. After Bethany had treated Johnson's leg wound, Miller helped both men arrange for rooms at the hotel, neither being in condition to care for themselves. Owen protested this arrangement too, insisting he could manage at his cabin, but when he nearly passed out trying to stand unaided, he reluctantly conceded. That evening, lying on the hotel bed, Owen heard a knock at his door. Assuming it was Miller checking on him, he called out, "It's open." To his surprise, it was Bethany who entered, medical bag in hand. "I've come to check your bandage," she explained, closing the door behind her. Owen sat up carefully, watching as she set her bag on the bedside table and began removing fresh bandages. Her presence in his hotel room felt oddly intimate, different from the professional setting of her office. "How's the pain?" she asked, helping him remove his shirt to access the bandage. "Manageable," he replied, though in truth, every movement sent jolts of fire through his side. Bethany gave him a knowing look as she gently removed the old bandage. "You don't always have to be stoic, you know. Force of habit." She examined the wound, seemingly satisfied that no bleeding had resumed. As she applied a fresh bandage, her fingers occasionally brushed against his skin, each touch sending a different kind of warmth through him. "You could have died today," she said quietly, not looking up from her work. "Part of the job. Is it worth it?" The question seemed to surprise her as much as him, as if she hadn't intended to voice it aloud. Owen considered before answering. "Today, yes, we stopped men who would have killed without hesitation, saved the stage driver, the passengers, protected the town's money." "And is that enough?" She pressed, finally meeting his eyes. "Is that enough to risk everything for?" He understood what she was really asking was vengeance or justice or whatever he called his dangerous lifestyle worth sacrificing the possibility of a future. For years, his answer would have been an unequivocal yes. Now, looking into Bethany's concerned eyes, he found himself less certain. "I don't know," he admitted. "For a long time, it was all I had." And now, her voice was barely above a whisper. The air between them seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. Owen reached up slowly, giving her time to move away if she chose, and touched her cheek. "Now I'm beginning to wonder if there might be something else worth living for." Bethany's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away from his touch. For a moment, they remained frozen in that tableau, his hand on her cheek, her hands still resting lightly against the bandage on his side. Then, with gentle deliberation, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was brief, tentative, a question rather than a declaration. When she pulled back, her cheeks were flushed, but her gaze remained steady. "Something to consider during your week of rest," she said, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she gathered her medical supplies. Owen watched her move toward the door, momentarily speechless. Before she left, he found his voice. "Bethany," she turned, hand on the doorknob. "I'll be careful," he promised. From now on, her smile widened slightly. "See that you are, Mr. Turner. I'd like to spend more time healing others and less time worrying about you." After she'd gone, Owen lay back on the bed, his mind replaying that unexpected kiss. For the first time in nearly a decade, he found himself thinking about the future, not just the next job or the next fight, but possibilities he'd long since abandoned. The week of enforced rest proved more challenging than any gunfight. Owen was not a man accustomed to idleness, and being confined to the hotel with only occasional walks down the street left him restless and irritable. His one consolation was Bethany's daily visits to check his wound and change his bandage. These visits maintained a professional veneer on the surface, but beneath that ran an undercurrent of growing connection. Sometimes their hands would touch longer than necessary. Sometimes their eyes would meet and hold until one of them looked away. They never mentioned the kiss, but its memory lingered between them, a promise of something neither was quite ready to define. By the end of the week, Owen's side had healed enough that Bethany reluctantly cleared him for limited activity. No riding hard, no lifting heavy objects, and absolutely no gunfights, she instructed sternly as she applied a final bandage. "The stitches need another week at least." "Yes, doctor," Owen replied with mock solemnity that earned him a reproving look. "I mean it, Owen. You've been given another chance. Don't waste it." The seriousness in her tone sobered him. "I won't," he promised. Then, before he could reconsider, he added, "Have dinner with me tonight." Bethany looked startled by the invitation. Dinner at the hotel restaurant. Nothing fancy, but better than eating alone. A smile slowly spread across her face. "I'd like that." That evening, Owen waited in the hotel restaurant, unaccountably nervous. He'd faced down outlaws without flinching, but found himself adjusting his collar and straightening his jacket repeatedly as he waited for Bethany to arrive. When she entered, several diners looked up in surprise. While it wasn't unusual to see the doctor in town, her appearance this evening was different. She'd exchanged her usual practical work dress for a gown of deep blue that complemented her eyes. Her honey-colored hair was arranged in a more elaborate style than her usual simple bun, with soft curls framing her face. Owen stood as she approached, suddenly aware of how many eyes were following her progress across the room. When she reached his table, he pulled out her chair with his good arm. "You look beautiful," he said quietly as she sat. A flush of color touched her cheeks. "Thank you. It's been a long time since I had occasion to wear anything but working clothes." The dinner began somewhat awkwardly, both of them unaccustomed to social niceties after years of focusing solely on their work. Gradually, however, they found their rhythm, conversation flowing more easily as they shared stories from their pasts. Bethany's years at medical college, Owen's early days as a rancher before tragedy redirected his life. "I never thought I'd find myself in a place like Mojave," Bethany admitted as they finished their meal. "Growing up in Philadelphia, the West seemed like another world, and now, Owen asked. Now it feels more like home than Philadelphia ever did, she replied. Here, people judge me by what I can do, not by preconceived notions of what a woman should be. You've certainly proven yourself, Owen said. Everyone's talking about how you saved Jenkins, and Johnson can't stop telling anyone who'll listen how you fixed his leg good as new. It's the work I was meant to do, she said simply. Helping people, healing them when I can, even stubborn gunslingers who don't know when to ask for help. A smile played at her lips. Especially them. As they left the restaurant, Owen offered his arm and Bethany took it without hesitation. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the desert sky as they walked slowly down Mojave's main street toward her office and adjoining living quarters. I never properly thanked you, Owen said as they walked, not just for patching me up, but for making me care again about living. Bethany stopped walking and turned to face him. You don't need to thank me for that, Owen. I do, he insisted. For years I've been half alive, existing, not living. You changed that. The moonlight silvered her features as she looked up at him. How? It was a simple question that demanded an honest answer. Owen took a moment to find the right words. By seeing me, he finally said. Not just the gunslinger or the bounty hunter or whatever role I was playing, you saw past all that to whatever was left of the man underneath. Bethany reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against the healing cut on his cheek. There's more of that man left than you realize. This time when they kissed, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Owen drew her closer with his good arm, mindful of his healing wound but unwilling to let caution deprive him of this moment. Bethany's arms slipped around his neck as she responded with unexpected passion, as if she too had been waiting for this confirmation that what was growing between them was real and mutual. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Owen rested his forehead against hers. I should go, he murmured, though everything in him rebelled against the idea of leaving her. Yes, she agreed, though her hands remained on his shoulders. You need rest to finish healing. Tomorrow, he asked, ride with me, just a short distance, nothing strenuous. As your doctor, I should say no, she replied with a small smile. But as your friend, I'd like that very much. The word friend hung between them, both knowing it no longer encompassed what they were becoming to each other, but neither ready to define it further. Tomorrow then, Owen said, reluctantly stepping back. I'll come by at noon. As he watched her enter her office, closing the door behind her with a final smile and wave, Owen felt a sense of possibility he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since losing his family, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow not just as another day to survive, but as a day to live. The following day dawned clear and mild, perfect for riding. Owen arrived at Bethany's office at noon as promised, leading 2 horses, his own bay gelding and a gentle mare borrowed from the livery. Bethany emerged wearing a practical riding outfit, her medical bag slung over her shoulder. Just in case, she explained with a meaningful glance at his side. Owen helped her mount, then swung carefully into his own saddle, mindful of his healing wound. There's a place I want to show you, he said as they rode out of town, not far, just beyond those hills. They rode at an easy pace, side by side when the trail allowed it. Bethany was a surprisingly confident rider for someone city-bred, explaining that her father had insisted she learn as part of her medical training. He believed a doctor should be able to reach patients however necessary, she said. Horse, buggy, on foot if required. Wise man, Owen commented. Out here, being able to ride can mean the difference between life and death. As they crested a small rise, the landscape opened up before them, a hidden valley nestled between rocky outcroppings, a small creek winding through its center. Wildflowers dotted the grassy expanse, splashes of color against the predominantly brown and gold landscape. It's beautiful, Bethany breathed, reining in her horse to take in the view. Found it by accident, tracking some strays last year, Owen explained. Not many people know about it. Too far from town for casual visitors, too small for ranchers to bother with. He led the way down to the creek, where a cluster of cottonwood trees provided shade. After helping Bethany dismount, he spread a blanket he'd brought in his saddlebags. A picnic, she asked, delighted. Nothing fancy, he warned, producing bread, cheese, and apples from his saddlebag along with a bottle of wine, but better than trail rations. They sat beneath the cottonwoods, eating and talking, occasionally falling into comfortable silences. Owen found himself sharing things he'd told no one his dreams before the tragedy, the guilt he'd carried for not being able to protect his family, the emptiness that had driven him to seek increasingly dangerous work. I wanted to die, he admitted quietly. Not enough to do it by my own hand, but enough to put myself in situations where others might do it for me. Bethany's hand covered his. And now, Owen looked at her, this remarkable woman who had somehow breached the walls he'd built around himself. Now I'm finding reasons to live. Her eyes softened with understanding. I know something about that. After my engagement ended after the rumors, there were days I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake pursuing medicine. What changed? I remembered why I became a doctor in the first place. Not for approval or acceptance, but because I believe every life has value. Her hand tightened on his, including mine and very much including yours. The simple statement, delivered with such quiet conviction, moved Owen deeply. He leaned forward and kissed her, a gentle affirmation of everything building between them. When they returned to town late that afternoon, something had shifted between them, a deeper understanding, a mutual acknowledgement of feelings that were becoming impossible to ignore. For the next few weeks, they settled into a pattern. Owen would stop by her office daily, ostensibly to have his wound checked, though it was healing well. Sometimes they would share a meal, sometimes just conversation. On days when Bethany wasn't busy with patients, they would ride out to their valley or walk along the creek that ran near town. Mojave noticed, of course. Small towns always did, but to Owen's surprise, the reaction was largely positive. Sheriff Miller clapped him on the back one day and said, "About time you found something worth living for besides trouble." Even old Jenkins, recovering from his amputation, winked and told Owen he'd picked a fine woman, even if she does cut parts off a man. The only open disapproval came from Harold Simmons, the banker, who made no secret of his belief that a lady doctor was an affront to proper society. When he overheard Simmons making disparaging remarks about Bethany in the saloon one evening, Owen had to be physically restrained by Miller from teaching the banker a painful lesson in respect. "He's not worth it," Miller counseled. "Besides, Doc Keller can fight her own battles." Saw her put Simmons in his place last week when he suggested she should restrict her practice to women's complaints. "What did she say?" Owen asked, curious. Miller grinned. "Told him she'd be happy to explain female anatomy to him in detailed medical terms if he felt educated enough to follow along." Man turned redder than a sunset and couldn't get away fast enough. The story was so characteristic of Bethany that Owen laughed, his anger dissipating. She was indeed capable of handling herself, one of the many things he admired about her. As spring turned to summer, Owen found himself spending less time hunting outlaws and more time helping Sheriff Miller with routine matters in town. He still rode patrol occasionally, still kept his guns cleaned and ready, but increasingly, his thoughts turned to more permanent, peaceful pursuits. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch outside Bethany's office watching the sunset paint the mountains, Owen broached a subject that had been on his mind. "There's a small ranch for sale," he said casually. "South of town, about 3 miles. Nothing fancy, but good water, decent grazing land." Bethany turned to look at him, a question in her eyes. "Are you thinking of buying it? Been considering it," he admitted. "I was a rancher before everything changed. Still remember how it's done." "It would be quite a change from your current life," she observed. "Would be," he agreed. "More settled, more predictable." "And is that what you want now, predictability?" Owen chose his next words carefully. "What I want is a future, Bethany. For the first time in years, I'm thinking beyond tomorrow or next week. I'm thinking about years from now. And what do you see?" Her voice was soft, expectant. "I see a life that has meaning beyond vengeance or justice, a life with purpose." He turned to face her directly. "A life with you if you'll have me." Bethany's eyes widened, and for a moment she said nothing, the only sound the distant piano from the saloon and the chirp of crickets in the gathering dusk. "Owen," she finally said, "are you proposing?" "Not very well, apparently," he replied with a self-deprecating smile. "But yes, I love you, Bethany. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you wrapped my wound in that saloon, working in that focused silence of yours. You brought me back to life." Tears glistened in her eyes, but she was smiling. "I love you too, but there's something you should know before you commit yourself." Owen waited, suddenly apprehensive. "I won't give up my practice," she said firmly. "Being a doctor isn't just what I do, it's who I am." Relief flooded through him. "I wouldn't ask you to. This town needs you. I need you exactly as you are. Even if it means I'll sometimes be called away at inconvenient hours, even if some people never accept a female doctor or a doctor's husband." Owen took her hand in his. "Bethany, I fell in love with you as you are brilliant, stubborn, compassionate Dr. Keller. Why would I want to change that?" Her smile was radiant as she leaned forward to kiss him. "Then yes," she said against his lips. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony in the town church. Most of Mojave turned out for the occasion, Sheriff Miller serving as Owen's best man, and surprisingly, Mrs. Jenkins, the miner's wife, standing up with Bethany. Even banker Simmons made an appearance, though he left immediately after the ceremony. Owen wore a new suit bought specially for the occasion. Bethany wore a dress of pale blue that she'd ordered from Tucson. After the ceremony, the town threw a celebration at the hotel, complete with music, dancing, and enough food to feed half the territory. Late in the evening, as the celebration continued around them, Owen led his new wife outside for a moment of quiet. The night was warm, stars brilliant overhead as they stood in the shadow of the hotel porch. "Happy?" he asked, drawing her close. "Completely," she replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "Though I keep expecting someone to rush up demanding medical attention." Owen laughed. "Give it time, night's still young." As if on cue, the hotel door burst open and Jimmy, the stable hand, rushed out, eyes wide with panic. Doc Turner," he called. "It's Mrs. Riley, the baby's coming early." Bethany straightened immediately, the doctor replacing the bride. "Where is she?" "At home, her husband's with her, but she's bleeding something awful." Owen felt Bethany tense beside him. "I need my bag," she said. "It's at the office." "I'll get it," Owen said immediately. "Meet you at the Rileys." As they parted ways, Bethany hurrying after Jimmy toward the Riley home on the edge of town, Owen heading for her office, he caught her hand briefly. "Welcome to married life, Mrs. Turner," he said with a wry smile. "Wouldn't have it any other way, Mr. Turner," she replied, squeezing his hand before hurrying away. As Owen retrieved her medical bag and hastened toward the Riley home, he reflected on the strange path that had brought him here. 9 years ago, he'd lost everything that mattered. He'd spent the subsequent years not caring whether he lived or died, accumulating scars both visible and hidden, pushing away anything that threatened to make him vulnerable again. Then a woman doctor had wrapped his wound in silence, and somehow, in that quiet moment of healing, had begun to heal his soul as well. By the time he reached the Riley home, delivering the medical bag to his wife, who was already issuing calm instructions to the frightened husband, Owen knew with absolute certainty that he'd found something worth living for, worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth cherishing for all the days to come. Not just survival, but life. Full, rich, sometimes messy, occasionally dangerous, but always meaningful life. With Bethany by his side, he was ready to embrace whatever the future might bring. 6 months after their wedding, Owen and Bethany moved into the ranch house Owen had purchased and renovated. It was a modest place, but solid and welcoming, with enough room for Bethany to maintain a small office for treating patients who lived too far from town to reach her main practice easily. Owen took to ranching again as if he'd never left it, though he still rode as a deputy for Sheriff Miller when needed. Bethany divided her time between her town office and her home practice, finding a balance that allowed her to continue her medical work while building a life with Owen. They faced challenges, of course. The hard winter of 1879–1880 nearly wiped out Owen's small herd. An influenza outbreak in the spring kept Bethany working day and night for weeks, Owen supporting her by delivering medicines. Preparing meals she rarely had time to eat, and occasionally forcing her to rest when exhaustion threatened to overcome her. Through it all, they grew stronger together, their different strengths complementing each other. Owen's protective instincts, once channeled solely into vengeance, now found healthier expression in safeguarding his wife, their home, and their community. Bethany's healing nature extended beyond her medical practice to help Owen finally make peace with his past. In the summer of 1880, their family expanded with the birth of their son, William Miller Turner, named for Owen's first son and for the sheriff who had become their close friend. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Sarah Elizabeth, completing their family circle. Owen never entirely abandoned his skills with a gun. The West was still wild enough that such abilities remained necessary. But now he used them judiciously, protectively, no longer seeking danger but facing it squarely when it couldn't be avoided. Bethany continued her practice into old age, eventually training several younger doctors who came west seeking opportunity, just as she had. She took particular satisfaction in mentoring 2 young women who had been inspired by her example to pursue medicine. As for the wound that had first brought them together, it left a scar, a permanent reminder of the day Owen Turner discovered something worth living for. Sometimes on cold mornings it would ache slightly, and Bethany would massage it with gentle fingers, the same fingers that had stitched him back together in more ways than one. "Still hurts?" she would ask. "Not anymore," Owen would always reply, covering her hand with his own. "Not since you healed it." They both knew he wasn't talking about the physical wound. Some scars ran deeper, marking not just flesh but soul. Those were the ones Bethany had truly healed, with patience and love and the quiet understanding that sometimes the most profound healing happens in silence.